Hi, welcome to Psychiatric Survivors, a show produced entirely by people with psychiatric disabilities. With me today is Garrett Smith. Garrett's from Portland, Oregon, and Garrett is a colleague of mine in the National Mental Health Consumers Association, where we're both board members, and we're both involved in the national organizing effort for people with psychiatric disabilities. Welcome, Garrett.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, since you have the opportunity of having you here, a little bit about the national scene and what you see going on in the country for people with psychiatric disabilities.
I might explain that I feel like a Johnny-come-lately to the national scene in some ways. There are persons for whom I have a great deal of respect who have a long history with the issues and the organizations at the national level, from whom, I think we've got a lot to learn, or I personally feel I have a lot to learn. One of my observations, I think, as I began to have opportunities to understand what was going on outside of Oregon as well as inside, was that we really lacked a unified voice at the national level. And I guess my involvement today is more out of concern for rectifying that, what I think is an unfortunate deficit than any other reason. I, along with everybody else, have an opportunity to observe advocacy groups at work, and there are a lot of advocacy groups for the disabled in one category or another. And we've seen very effective work done around the Americans with Disabilities Act and other initiatives that is very heartening. And certainly psychiatric survivors have a point of view, a history, and an agenda that is powerful, but it hasn't been powerfully represented and articulated, I think. And there, I suppose, are a lot of reasons for that. One of the things that I think is our strength, too, is the diversity of views that persons who have a major experience with psychiatric illness and with the systems, is that we come out of it with different reactions, different experiences, and different agendas. So the trick, I suppose, has been to accommodate a wide view of personal opinion and philosophical bent on the one hand, and yet speak with some power in a unified way on the other. And
right.
So I would guess, even though I don't go back that far, that it's been very difficult to have a focal point for a national organization, that there have been splinter groups, that there have been different groups, and if you think in terms of power, the power shifts between different groups and so on, depending partly on philosophical things and partly on the power of the persons involved in leadership roles. I'm real encouraged, I think, to be a part of a reorganization and a recharging of the National Mental Health Consumers Association, because the structure of its national organization seems to me to be workable now. The breadth of the representation among its board members in terms of philosophical point of view seems to be wide, and yet the people working together seem to be able to effectively work together. So though there's an enormously long way to go for the organization to become simply functional in a powerful way, and to gain audiences, I think we're on the right track, and that feels real good.
I've been really, become really forgiving of us over the years, because I think we are in the real sense, a grassroots movement. A lot is done locally, and a lot is done state by state, as you know. And I think we're evolving towards, a national voice. I think that's going to come, and it's going to happen. I think everybody's wanted it to happen so badly for so long, and people have made so many attempts at it, and I just maybe think we just weren't ready. I think that's been part of the problem. Certainly some of the, the factionalism or the infighting, I guess, takes place in any organization, but I think it just hasn't been our time yet, You've seen a lot of the different state organizations, right? Do you think you have a pretty good overview of like what the various, what's happening? I mean, you have a sense of what's happening?
If the sampling is good, I have had the opportunity to travel some and talk to folks from other states about what's going on at the state level and their grassroots level. Extrapolating from that is for me difficult. You know more about this area, I think, than I do.
Well, we've seen it in trying to produce the satellite TV conferences so far. We contacted each state, and we've had, we have a sense from talking to their departments of mental health and to the consumer groups and to, whatever organizational structure everybody seems to have. We've had a sense of, who's who and what's what and what's real and what's not, We've gotten that kind of, sense of things, but that's really where you have to see it is, sort of state by state,
And, we talk about ourselves as being a grassroots movement, but the natural history of grassroots movements, I think, is various. It seems to me that some state organizations have not been the result of a coming together of a series of smaller organizations around the state, but they've really been developed top down. In Oregon, for instance, I wasn't really involved in this, but decided to seek grant money from the federal government to create a statewide network organization. The principal job for which was to foster the development of small groups around the state. So really there was a stronger state organization trying to build a foundation after the house was built than would be ideal if you were a proponent of a from the bottom up kind of development.
Yeah, and I've seen that in states too. Yeah.
And I don't suppose it makes much difference as long as you get there.
Yeah.
And I think, too, we have leadership. I really think personalities have made a big difference in different states. And we have a very strong woman in a part of our state where there has been no organization until now. And, I've been able to track that particular development, and it's attributable to a fairly favorable climate, but the efforts of this one woman, and she is, a powerhouse. And eventually, I think the people around her will be incorporated and become collectively a strong regional organization.
You see that too in different states. The states that have, a strong leader, have one personal, charismatic type of person, tend to produce all kinds of results, and states, I think, are aware of that.
Well, of course, the state's reactions to grassroots consumer organizations have a big effect on how they develop, too. And so do leadership styles. When you have a confrontational, a combative leader, I suppose the nature of the organization is different than if you have one who tends to want to keep the waters smooth.
Well, I think there is that. I mean, I think we've seen that too. That some people are there. Some people are there as advocates, and some people are there as I don't know, tokens, I guess.
Yeah, right. I was having trouble with the word for that too.
Yeah. I guess that what I've seen happen overall, though, is that regardless of how it happens, that there is something happening that seems to be growing, every day, that seems to be growing maybe in 1,000 different ways, I hate to think of George Bush and his 1,000 points of light, but, there has to be diversity, in any movement, and I think that we're beginning to see that in our movement. There's a lot of different approaches, there's Joel Slack in Alabama, who's become senior management in the Department of Mental Health, and at the same time you've got the famous David Oakes in Oregon, who stays true to the fundamental New Left principles of the 60s, right?
And we need both of those
Yeah,
gentlemen and others
yeah,
too.
yeah, the management types and the radical types, sure.
I also think that our agenda changes as the mental health system changes. And, when deinstitutionalization began in the 60s and late 50s, there were a lot of genuine grievances among those of us receiving public mental health services when hospitals were closed, and we were moved from the hospital to the community, but the community wasn't ready to provide us the services we needed. And it may not be a lot better today, but I think, I think I have learned that it is better today for those of us who are trying to get whatever it is we need to keep going or to improve. And so in a sense, the need to combat, or the battlefield, has shifted some. We'll never have enough resources, and we're always going to have to advocate for I think, mostly more money, but we need to have good ideas about how to spend that money if we do get it. So we're needing to advocate with the establishment, both legislative and bureaucratic, for that. And certainly abuses continue, but I think attacking abusive behaviors and getting corrections of those is easier today probably than it used to be.
Well, there's a protection and advocacy system now that never existed before, too.
Funding for which currently, as we talk, is very much in jeopardy. Not because of their activities as much as the overall budget picture, I think. But that tells us something.
Yeah. What have you all done in Oregon? I mean, you have an organization called the Mind Empowered. What's the Mind Empowered about?
The Mind Empowered is an organization composed almost exclusively of persons with psychiatric disabilities. A few of our board members who can be helpful to us in technical ways are not consumers, but everybody else is. We started with a federal grant, one of the 15 demonstration projects that were funded, like White Light Communications. To provide a drop-in center but at an advocacy center, and I use advocacy in the sense of advocating for people to get the services they need, as well as advocating for a better service system more generally. But besides the self-help that goes on within the walls of the building that we rent, we are fairly proactive in trying to assist people in getting whatever it is they may themselves feel they need in order to lead more stable lives. Added to that recently has been a case management program to get 30 long-term residents of our state hospital out of the hospital, because we believe that with adequate supports they could lead much better quality lives in the community than they could by simply staying year after year in the state hospital. So we've become and are viewed as a service delivery organization using models that are different than the models being used by the mental health establishment around us. Some experimental models being tried and some willingness to work with folks that the rest of the system essentially has given up on. And I'd like to insert that that's going very well and is being viewed with great interest and a fair amount of respect. Our organization, too, being the strongest identified consumer organization in the state, is invited to act in an advocacy role and be involved in policy development from the legislative level on down. And in Oregon, this is not universal, but very often persons responsible for managing the mental health system are truly interested in how consumers view the policy issues that are on the table. And so we're active in and invited often to participate in the system's issues. And I believe that we're not being egocentric to say that we've had a fair impact, and that our participation hasn't been just tokenism.
You mentioned to me earlier when we were talking that you are on a policy committee, right? And are you in line to be chair or have been elected chair of a policy committee?
In line to be. There is in Oregon a committee called the Systems Management Council, which has representation from all of the major players in the system, from clinic directors to superintendents of our state hospitals, to family members, and to members of the mental health division. And that committee is charged with reviewing and making decisions about how our systems will operate. And we're in the midst of a major policy and organizational change to reduce substantially the number of people in our state hospitals and treat them in the community instead. That itself was a major policy issue. This committee, of which I've been a member for some time, is, in my view, sort of right at the core of the activity which determines what mental health services in Oregon look like. And the reason I think Paul brought up the fact that I'm the vice chairman of that committee and assumed to be chairman next time around, as pertinent, is that it may reflect the fact that the system isn't afraid to have a consumer in a position of power, both on that committee and as a result of the consequences of that committee's actions, that it was thought appropriate to have, a consumer-centered policy-making committee. Not that I have a lot of power over their decisions, but I certainly have an opportunity to be heard.
Yeah, exactly. You've been involved with the National Institute of Mental Health, too, in reviewing grants and seeing some of the things that are happening in some of the other states, too. What kinds of things have you seen in that? I mean, what have you learned about the other states through that?
I guess I've learned that there's an enormous variety of activity going on in the different states. And the National Institutes of Mental Health, and I think this is really interesting, it's a very large bureaucracy, but it's probably been the principal supporter for the development of consumer groups or psychiatric survivor groups and family member groups in the country. And it's been a controversial position, but the federal government has been willing to put some money on the line, and not a lot, but in critical areas. So each state is eligible to request funds for the support of the consumer activities going on in its state. And these are competitive grant applications, and there is a policy board or a review board that decides who's going to get the grants. And by being asked to be on it, I not only have an opportunity to express my opinion about which are the most viable, important proposed projects, but have myself had a chance to sort of review what's going on in different states. And, there's a great variety of level of development. I mean, some states are far ahead of other states by any measure that you might choose. And the activities that those states propose to pursue, and the consumer groups and the family groups in those states have to participate in the development of the grant application. So you can assume that those grant applications reflect consumer and family member values to some extent anyway. One of the things that's being proposed with greater frequency now is to train consumer advocates in how to be effective advocates. We're looking at very complicated state mental health systems and legislative systems. And just one may have experienced major mental illness and one may have been in treatment in the mental health system for years, but that doesn't train you about the whole system and how effectively to argue for your values, whatever they may be. So training people it's real counterproductive almost to appoint our psychiatric survivor to a committee, which they are not trained to be a full-playing part of.
Do you think that people can be trained like that?
Well, yes and no. I I don't know much about how those programs have worked.
Yeah.
I think I have seen some very effective advocacy from people who really may not know what's going on around them, but they know what they want. I mean, I remember a debate at our board of directors about whether we should apply for some housing, for some supported housing.
Mm-hmm.
And it got very complicated. It was federal money and state money, and the roles of each of the players were real complicated. And one of our board members finally said, as it looked as if we might not decide to do this because it was too complicated, she said, all I want is a decent place to live. And I don't care about all this other stuff. So I've seen some very effective advocacy, because she carried the day in that particular debate,
Right.
by persons who are simply able to effectively and simply express their needs.
I mean, that's how I started. I mean, that's why I ask about training, because it doesn't seem to me to be an academic skill. I mean, either you're actively going to work on your own behalf initially for benefits, for housing, for jobs, for, right to receive or refuse treatment, the whole gamut of issues that you have to deal with to survive the system, or not. And then learning curve part two is once you're out of it yourself and then you take it on sort of on behalf of everybody else, then you have this other whole kind of training experience with the system, but it's sort of a hands-on training. It's not a, there are no chalkboards to tell you, I don't think, how to deal with, a state representative or or a commissioner of mental health. Now, there may be, I don't know, but, my experience is that it's, that you do it because it's real, because you feel like you have to do it,
I think there's a broader issue here too, and that is, and it's probably true for all advocacy organizations and grassroots movements, we need to train leadership. And I think we're deplorably dependent on too few people for our leadership. And as we become identified as leaders, we're asked over and over again to do certain things. And but I think it's our responsibility in the movement to train effective participants in the movement more than seeking a federal grant to train the trainers to train the consumers.
Yeah. Getting people involved, I mean, I think is the way to do it, don't you? I mean,
I do.
Yeah, I mean, if people go to the legislature and, get what we call in Vermont granite fever, right? Then off they go, they're every day they're at the legislature and you spend time there, you learn things,
I think it's very empowering and validating to be taken seriously as a human being when you're engaged in advocacy activity. And I need to keep reminding myself and others that empowerment is not something you can do for somebody else. They have to feel that they're engaged in a valid activity. And I think experience and being with other people in advocacy is the way empowerment comes about. But it's not handed down through a training program.
Right. What do you think about our national support system? I mean, once in a while you and I will get together and, talk for a day or two, and then we don't see each other for another 6 months or a year, and that's true for, the other people that you and I know around the country who have been identified as leaders. I mean, in a way, we are the support group we are for each other, but...
Well, I was telling you last night that as I drove to your place in Vermont, that the pleasure with which I look forward to the visit had in part to do with knowing I was coming to a place where I could be myself and not play a role. I think I personally, anyway, in Oregon, feel desperate sometimes for somebody to talk with, who I view as a peer.
As a peer, yeah.
In my organization, I don't have a supervisor except my board of directors, and they haven't chosen to play that role with me. So I'm seeking support. And you get it where you can find it, but because you and I are 2,500 miles apart or something like that, we maybe we go to more conferences than we otherwise would just for the pleasure of seeing each other, you know. And NIMH has sponsored some get-togethers, which and others have helped us get together in ways that I think are really useful. Our opening conversation about the National Mental Health Consumers Association is. Comes to mind because I think those of us involved in an organization at the national level may be motivated in part by our need to get together.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's good that we can get together today, and I'm glad we had a chance to talk a little bit about what we're doing for television and for people out there. Thanks, Garrett. Thanks for joining us.
Enjoyed being here.
Yeah. Thanks, too, for joining Psychiatric Survivors, and we'll see you again.